The music stopped the moment the doors opened, and every head in the ballroom turned at once. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the fireplace with a glass of champagne in her hand, laughing at something her cousin had said, when she felt the air in the room change. She turned toward the entrance, expecting to see Duke Alexander Ravensworth walking in alone, fashionably late as always, ready to kiss her hand and apologize with that crooked smile she loved so much. Instead, she saw him walking in with a woman on his arm. The woman wore a deep red gown that stood out against the pale blues and golds of the birthday decorations Eleanor had spent 3 weeks arranging. Her dark hair was pinned up with small white flowers, and she moved beside Alexander with the easy confidence of someone who had been in a room like this many times before. Eleanor's smile did not fall right away. For a moment, her mind refused to accept what her eyes were showing her. Margaret, her closest friend since childhood, appeared at her side within seconds, gripping her arm so tightly it almost hurt. Eleanor barely noticed. She was still watching Alexander cross the ballroom floor, his steps unhurried, as if nothing about this moment was unusual at all. "Eleanor," Margaret whispered, her voice tight and urgent. "Eleanor, look at me." But Eleanor could not look away. Alexander had reached the center of the room now, and the woman beside him was smiling politely at the guests, nodding as if she belonged there, as if this was simply another evening at another party. Eleanor set her champagne glass down on a nearby table, with a hand that had begun to tremble, though her face remained calm. 24 years old today, and she had never felt so exposed in her entire life. Every person in that ballroom, from her father's business partners to her mother's oldest friends, was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. She took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked forward. This was the moment that would define the rest of Eleanor Whitmore's life, though she did not know it yet. She only knew that the man she had planned to marry had just brought another woman to her birthday, in front of everyone who mattered to her, and that whatever happened in the next few minutes could never be undone. 6 months earlier, Eleanor's life had looked entirely different. She had met Alexander at a charity dinner hosted by her father's shipping company, one of dozens of formal events she attended every year without much enthusiasm. She had expected another evening of polite conversation with men who cared more about her father's business connections than about her. Instead, she found herself seated beside a tall man with sharp gray eyes and an easy laugh, who asked her real questions and actually listened to her answers. Alexander Ravensworth carried the title of Duke, inherited from his father 3 years earlier, along with an estate that required far more money to maintain than his family currently possessed. Eleanor did not know this at the time. She only knew that he made her laugh in a room full of stiff formality, that he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions about the novels she read and the causes she supported, and that when he looked at her, she felt like the only person in the room. Within weeks, he was calling on her at her family's townhouse. Within 2 months, he had asked her father for permission to court her properly. Her father, a practical man who had built his fortune through careful decisions, saw the match as a good one. A title connected to the family name would open doors that money alone could not. Eleanor, for her part, believed she had found real love, the kind she had read about in books, and hoped, without much confidence, that she might one day experience herself. The engagement was announced at a garden party in early spring. Eleanor remembered standing beside Alexander as he slid a ring onto her finger, a ring with a single sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, and feeling as though her life had finally begun. Her friends congratulated her with genuine happiness. Her mother cried. Her father shook Alexander's hand and spoke of the wedding as though it were already a settled and joyful fact. For the first month after the engagement, everything felt exactly as it should. Alexander visited often, sent flowers on ordinary Tuesdays for no particular reason, and spoke with Eleanor about their future, as though he had already imagined every detail of it. He described the estate he wanted to restore, the gardens he wanted to plant, the children he hoped they would raise together. Eleanor allowed herself to believe every word. It was Margaret who first noticed the change. Margaret Ashford had known Eleanor since they were both 6 years old, sharing a nursery governess and, later, a boarding school dormitory. She was the kind of friend who noticed things before Eleanor did, and who was not afraid to say them out loud, even when Eleanor did not want to hear them. "He has been distracted lately," Margaret said one afternoon, as the two of them sat in Eleanor's garden with cups of tea, slowly growing cold between them. Have you noticed?" Eleanor had noticed, though she had been trying not to think about it too carefully. Alexander's visits had become shorter. His letters, once filled with small details about his day, had grown brief and vague. When she asked him about his plans, he answered in general terms, as though his mind were somewhere else entirely. "He has a great deal to manage," Eleanor said, more to convince herself than to answer Margaret. "The estate takes up much of his time. There are debts from his father's years, and he is trying to set things right before the wedding." Margaret's expression did not change, but something in her eyes suggested she was not satisfied with this explanation. "I saw him at the theater last week," she said carefully. "He was not alone." Eleanor's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "He was likely with friends from his club. Alexander has many acquaintances." "He was with a woman, Eleanor. They sat together in a private box, away from the other guests. I only saw them for a moment before the lights went down, but it did not look like a chance meeting between old friends." Eleanor set her cup down carefully, aware that her hand wanted to shake and unwilling to let it. "Who was she?" "I do not know. I did not recognize her. But Eleanor, I thought you should know, even if it turns out to be nothing at all." For the rest of that afternoon, Eleanor told herself that Margaret had simply been mistaken, or that there was a reasonable explanation she had not yet considered. Alexander had many responsibilities, many people who required his attention, and it was unfair to assume the worst based on a brief glimpse across a darkened theater. She wore her ring that evening and looked at it often, as if the weight of the sapphire on her finger could steady the uncertainty rising in her chest. When Alexander visited 2 days later, Eleanor almost asked him about the theater directly. She almost asked him to explain who the woman had been and why he had not mentioned the outing to her. But when he arrived, he brought with him a small gift, a book of poetry she had once mentioned wanting to read, and he spoke with such warmth about their wedding plans that her doubts felt suddenly foolish and small. She decided, that evening, that trust was more important than suspicion, and that she would not allow one second-hand observation to poison what she and Alexander had built together. It was a decision she would later regret, though not for the reasons she expected. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Alexander's absences grew longer. His explanations grew vaguer. There were evenings when he claimed to be occupied with estate business, and Eleanor, checking casually with mutual acquaintances, learned that he had not been seen at the properties he claimed to be managing. There were dinners he canceled at the last moment, citing sudden obligations that he never fully explained. Each time, Eleanor felt a small stab of doubt, and each time, she pushed it aside, telling herself that a man managing an inherited title and a struggling estate had every right to an unpredictable schedule. Margaret continued to worry, though she said less about it after their first conversation, sensing that Eleanor was not yet ready to hear more. Instead, she watched, and waited, and made a few quiet inquiries of her own among people she trusted. What Margaret discovered, she kept to herself for a little while longer, unsure of how or when to tell her closest friend that the man she was planning to marry had been keeping company with another woman for nearly 2 years, since long before he had ever met Eleanor at all. As Eleanor's birthday approached, she pushed her doubts firmly aside and focused instead on the celebration she had been planning for weeks. This year felt important to her, not simply because she was turning 24, but because it would be the last birthday she celebrated before her wedding. She wanted the evening to be beautiful, memorable, and full of the people she loved most. She chose her family's largest reception hall for the party, the same room where her parents had hosted her christening celebration decades earlier. She spent hours selecting flowers, choosing pale blue hydrangeas and white roses that would complement the dress she planned to wear, a gown in Alexander's favorite shade of blue silk, cut in a style she knew he admired. She wrote out the guest list herself, carefully considering every name, wanting to surround herself with the people who had shaped her life. She also thought carefully about Alexander's role in the evening. She imagined him arriving early, perhaps proposing a toast in front of their assembled families, perhaps even announcing a firm date for their wedding, something she had been gently encouraging him to settle on for weeks. She imagined dancing with him under the chandelier her grandmother had once danced beneath, and she allowed herself, despite everything, to feel hopeful about the direction her life was taking. She did not know, as she made these plans, that the woman from the theater would walk through the doors of her birthday celebration on Alexander's arm, in front of everyone she had ever trusted, and that the life she had imagined would begin to unravel before the candles on her cake were even lit. The morning of her birthday arrived bright and clear, the kind of late spring day that seemed to promise good things. Eleanor woke early, unable to sleep any longer, and spent the morning overseeing the final preparations for the evening. She checked the seating arrangements twice, walked through the reception hall to confirm that every flower arrangement stood exactly where she wanted it, and tried on her gown one final time, in front of her bedroom mirror, turning slowly to admire how the pale blue silk caught the light. Her mother came to her room in the early afternoon, carrying a small velvet box. "This belonged to your grandmother," her mother said, opening the box to reveal a pair of pearl earrings, simple and elegant. "She wore them on her wedding day, and I wore them on mine. I thought you might like to wear them tonight." Eleanor accepted the earrings with genuine happiness, fastening them into place as her mother watched with quiet pride. For a moment, standing together in the soft afternoon light, mother and daughter shared a quiet understanding that transcended words. Eleanor felt, in that moment, entirely loved and entirely safe. She did not yet know that safety was an illusion about to be shattered. By early evening, guests had begun arriving at the reception hall. Eleanor greeted each one personally, accepting congratulations on her upcoming wedding, along with birthday wishes, feeling the warmth of genuine affection from people who had known her for years. Her father's business partners arrived in formal dress, along with their wives, and her mother's closest friends filled the room with cheerful conversation. Distant cousins she rarely saw appeared, along with childhood friends she had grown up beside, and by the time the orchestra began to play, the reception hall was filled with nearly 200 guests, all gathered to celebrate Eleanor Whitmore's 24th birthday. Margaret arrived early, as she always did, and found Eleanor near the entrance, greeting a stream of well-wishers with practiced grace. "You look beautiful," Margaret said, embracing her friend warmly. "Truly beautiful." "Thank you for coming early," Eleanor said, smiling. "I wanted a moment with you before things become too busy." The two friends found a quiet corner near the fireplace, away from the growing crowd, and spoke for several minutes about small, comfortable things, the kind of easy conversation that had defined their friendship for nearly 2 decades. Eleanor felt herself relaxing for the first time in days, grateful for Margaret's steady presence beside her. It was nearly an hour into the celebration when Eleanor first noticed that Alexander had not yet arrived. She checked the small clock on the mantelpiece, telling herself that he was simply running late, as he so often did. She continued greeting guests, continued accepting congratulations, continued smiling through conversations about wedding plans that felt increasingly hollow with each passing minute that Alexander remained absent. Margaret watched her friend carefully throughout this time, noticing the slight tension building in Eleanor's shoulders, the way her eyes flickered toward the entrance every few minutes despite her attempts to appear unconcerned. Margaret said nothing, unwilling to voice the worry that had been growing in her own chest for weeks now, hoping against her better judgment that tonight, of all nights, Alexander would not disappoint her closest friend. The orchestra began a new piece, a waltz that Eleanor recognized as one of her favorites, and several couples moved toward the center of the floor to dance. Eleanor watched them for a moment, imagining how the evening was supposed to unfold, imagining Alexander's hand in hers as they moved together beneath the chandelier, and felt a small ache of disappointment that he was not yet there to share this moment with her. Her father approached, offering his arm. "Might I have this dance with my daughter before her future husband claims all her attention?" Eleanor smiled and accepted, grateful for the distraction, and allowed her father to lead her onto the floor. As they moved together to the music, she pushed her worry about Alexander's absence firmly aside, determined not to let it spoil an evening she had worked so hard to create. Whatever the reason for his delay, she told herself, he would arrive soon, and the evening would proceed exactly as she had planned. She had no way of knowing, as she danced with her father beneath the warm glow of the chandelier, that within the hour, her carefully planned celebration would become the moment everyone in that room would remember for years to come, and that the life she had imagined for herself would change forever before the night was through. The dance ended, and Eleanor returned to Margaret's side, slightly breathless and smiling, despite the small worry still nagging at the back of her mind. She accepted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter and turned to survey the room, taking a moment to appreciate how beautifully everything had come together. The flowers she had chosen filled the hall with a soft fragrance. The candles cast a warm golden light across the assembled guests, and the laughter and conversation surrounding her felt like a gift she had earned through weeks of careful planning. She was still admiring the room when the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the orchestra, mid-note, seemed to falter slightly before continuing. Eleanor turned toward the entrance, expecting at last to see Alexander arriving alone, ready with an apology for his lateness and a story about whatever estate business had delayed him. Instead, she saw him walking through the doors with a woman on his arm, a woman in a deep red gown who moved with easy confidence through a room full of strangers, as though she had every right to be there. For a moment, Eleanor's mind refused to process what she was seeing. Perhaps, she thought desperately, this was simply a family friend, someone Alexander had brought along for an innocent reason she had not yet considered. Perhaps there was an explanation that would make sense of this strange and unwelcome sight. But even as these thoughts formed, some deeper part of Eleanor already understood the truth. She recognized something in the way Alexander held himself beside this woman, something familiar and intimate that he had never quite managed to disguise. Not even now, not even here, in front of everyone who mattered most to Eleanor in the world. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice tight with alarm. "Eleanor, that is the woman from the theater." The music continued to play, though it now sounded distant and strange to Eleanor's ears, as though it were coming from somewhere far away. She watched Alexander and the woman cross the reception hall, watched the guests around them fall into confused, whispering silence, watched 200 pairs of eyes turn from the entrance to Eleanor herself, waiting to see how she would respond to this unimaginable moment. Eleanor set down her champagne glass on a nearby table, her hand trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. She was 24 years old today, standing in a room full of people who loved her, watching the man she had planned to marry walk toward her with another woman on his arm, and she understood, with sudden and terrible clarity, that whatever she chose to do in the next few minutes would follow her for the rest of her life. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and began to walk forward to meet them. The crowd parted slightly as Eleanor moved forward, the way water parts around a stone, and she felt the weight of every stare pressing against her from all directions. She kept her chin level and her steps even, though her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the people nearest her could hear it. Alexander saw her coming, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise quickly replaced by an uneasy smile. He had clearly not expected her to approach so directly, so soon, in front of so many witnesses. He had perhaps imagined a quieter moment, a private word exchange somewhere out of earshot, where he might offer some explanation before anyone else noticed the woman beside him. But Eleanor had no intention of retreating into a corner to have this conversation in whispers. Not tonight, not on her own birthday, in her own family's home, surrounded by people who had known her since she was a child. "Eleanor," Alexander said, his voice carrying a forced brightness that did not match the tension in his shoulders. "Happy birthday. You look wonderful." Eleanor did not answer immediately. Her eyes moved instead to the woman standing beside him, taking in the deep red gown, the carefully arranged dark hair, the polite but wary smile that suggested this woman understood exactly how uncomfortable this introduction was about to become. "I do not believe we have met," Eleanor said, her voice steady and clear, carrying further across the now silent room than she had intended. Alexander's hand moved slightly, as though he wanted to step between the two women, but thought better of it. "Eleanor, this is Isabelle Fontaine. She is a friend from London. I thought, since we were both attending the opera earlier this evening, that it would be simpler to bring her along rather than leave her waiting." It was a thin explanation, and Eleanor could see in the faces of the guests nearest her that no one in the room believed it either. The opera did not run until nearly midnight, and it was barely past 8. Whatever excuse Alexander had prepared, he had not prepared it well. Isabelle extended a gloved hand toward Eleanor, her expression carefully neutral. "Happy birthday," she said quietly. "I hope you do not mind the intrusion. Alexander insisted I come." Eleanor did not take the offered hand. She simply looked at Isabelle for a long moment, studying her face, searching for some sign of guilt or discomfort, and finding instead only a practiced calm that suggested this was not the first time Isabelle had been placed in an uncomfortable social situation because of Alexander's carelessness. "How long have you known my fiancé?" Eleanor asked, her voice still steady, though something cold was beginning to settle in her chest. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Isabelle glanced toward Alexander, as though seeking permission to answer honestly, and Alexander's face had gone pale. "Eleanor," he said quickly, "perhaps we should speak privately." "I asked a simple question," Eleanor replied, not moving. "How long have you known each other?" It was Margaret who answered, stepping forward from where she had been standing just behind Eleanor's shoulder, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. "Nearly 2 years, Eleanor. I learned as much this week, though I did not know how to tell you before tonight." The room, already quiet, fell into a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear the faint hiss of the candles burning in their sconces along the walls. 2 years. Alexander had known this woman for nearly 2 years, which meant he had known her long before he had ever met Eleanor at that charity dinner, long before he had asked her father for permission to court her, long before he had slid a sapphire ring onto her finger and spoken of a future he apparently had no intention of building with her alone. Eleanor turned to look at Alexander directly, and for the first time that evening, she allowed the guests around her to see exactly what she was feeling. Not fury, not yet, though fury was building somewhere beneath the surface. What crossed her face first was something quieter and more devastating, the visible collapse of a belief she had held with complete confidence for 6 months, the belief that she was loved honestly by the man standing in front of her. "Is this true?" she asked him. Alexander's mouth opened, then closed. He glanced around at the assembled guests, all of whom were watching this unfold with a mixture of horror and fascination, and Eleanor could see him calculating, trying to find some version of the truth that would not destroy everything at once. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice low, "let me explain. Please, not here." "You brought her here," Eleanor said. "You brought her into my home, to my birthday, in front of my family and my friends. I think here is exactly where you should explain." Isabel, to her credit, looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Eleanor and Alexander as though realizing, perhaps for the first time, the full weight of the situation she had walked into. "Alexander," she said quietly, "you told me this would not be difficult. You said your engagement was already ending, that you had already spoken with her about it." The words landed like a physical blow. Eleanor felt her breath catch, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt slightly beneath her feet. She had spoken with Alexander only 3 days earlier, and he had said nothing of the kind. He had spoken instead of wedding dates and honeymoon destinations, of the estate gardens he wanted to show her, of a future that he had apparently already decided would never happen. "He told you our engagement was ending," Eleanor repeated slowly, testing the words, trying to understand how a man could speak so casually of ending a relationship to one woman while planning a wedding with another. Isabel's face had gone pale now too, and she took a small step back from Alexander, as though suddenly aware that she had been deceived as thoroughly as Eleanor had. "He told me you both had agreed it was not working, that the wedding would likely be called off quietly, without much fuss." "We agreed to no such thing," Eleanor said, her voice finally beginning to shake, though whether from anger or heartbreak, she could not tell. 3 days ago, this man sat across from me in my own drawing room and spoke of nothing but our wedding. He showed me sketches of the gardens he wanted to plant for our children. He asked me whether I preferred a summer wedding or an autumn one. The murmurs in the room had grown louder now, guests turning to whisper to one another, some looking at Alexander with open disgust, others simply watching Eleanor with sympathetic, horrified expressions. Her mother had appeared at the edge of the crowd, her hand pressed to her mouth, and her father stood beside her, his face darkening with an anger Eleanor had rarely seen in him. Alexander seemed to realize, all at once, that the situation was slipping entirely beyond his control. Whatever plan he had imagined for the evening, whatever careful explanation he had prepared to offer Eleanor privately, had collapsed the moment Isabel spoke honestly about what he had told her. "Eleanor, please," he said again, reaching toward her arm. Eleanor stepped back before his hand could reach her, and the movement, small as it was, seemed to communicate something to the entire room more clearly than any words could have. She was not going to allow him to touch her again, not tonight, and perhaps not ever. "You lied to her," Eleanor said, nodding toward Isabel, though her eyes remained fixed on Alexander. "And you lied to me. I would like to understand which version of the truth you actually intended to live by, or whether you simply intended to keep lying to both of us for as long as you could manage it." Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, something defensive flickered across his face, as though he might try to justify himself, might try to explain, that circumstances beyond his control had forced him into this position. But whatever excuse he considered offering, he seemed to think better of it, perhaps recognizing that no explanation would satisfy the room full of witnesses now watching him with open judgment. "I did not know how to tell you," he said instead, his voice quiet now, almost pleading. "I care for you, Eleanor. That was never a lie. But things became complicated, and I did not know how to end things honestly without hurting you. And so instead," Eleanor said, "you decided the kindest solution was to bring her to my birthday celebration and let me discover the truth in front of 200 guests." Alexander had no answer for this, and his silence was, in its own way, the clearest confession he could have offered. Margaret placed a steadying hand on Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor was grateful for the contact, grateful for the reminder that she was not entirely alone in this moment, even as the man she had loved stood before her, exposed as someone she had never truly known at all. Isabel, who had remained silent for the last several exchanges, finally spoke again, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I did not know about you," she said to Eleanor. "I want you to believe that, even if nothing else tonight makes sense. He told me the engagement was already finished. I would never have agreed to come here otherwise." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, and something in Isabel's expression, the genuine distress, the visible embarrassment at having been used as a pawn in Alexander's deception, convinced Eleanor that this, at least, was likely true. "I believe you," Eleanor said finally, "which means we have both been deceived by the same man, in different ways, for entirely different lengths of time." The weight of this realization seemed to settle over both women at once, and for a strange, brief moment, something like understanding passed between them. Two people who had been wronged by the same source, standing together in the wreckage of a man's careless lies. Alexander, watching this exchange, seemed to understand that he had lost control of the narrative entirely. Whatever sympathy he might have hoped to receive, whatever explanation he might have offered to soften the situation, had evaporated the moment Isabel confirmed, in front of everyone, that he had lied to both women simultaneously. "Eleanor," he tried once more, "can we not discuss this somewhere private? This is not the place." "You made this the place," Eleanor interrupted, her voice sharper now, carrying an edge that silenced whatever he had intended to say next. "You chose to bring her here tonight. You chose this room, this celebration, these witnesses. Whatever happens next, you do not have the right to suddenly ask for privacy." Her father moved through the crowd then, reaching Eleanor's side, his presence solid and reassuring. "Alexander," he said, his voice low and controlled, though the anger beneath it was unmistakable, "I think it would be best if you left my daughter's celebration." Alexander looked at Eleanor's father, then back at Eleanor herself, and something in his expression shifted from defensive to genuinely desperate. Whatever calculations he had been making, whatever hope he had held that this situation could still be salvaged, seemed to collapse entirely under the weight of Eleanor's father's quiet authority. "Eleanor," Alexander said one final time, his voice barely above a whisper now, "I never meant to hurt you like this." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm again, steady in a way that surprised even her. "Intentions do not change what happened," she said. "You brought your lover to my birthday. Whatever you meant by it, that is what you did." The word lover, spoken plainly in front of 200 guests, seemed to echo through the room long after Eleanor had finished speaking. She watched it land on Alexander's face like a physical blow, watched him flinch, as though the honesty of the word had wounded him more deeply than any accusation she could have made. Around them, the party had effectively ended, though no one had officially announced its conclusion. Guests stood in small, whispering clusters, some watching the unfolding scene with open curiosity, others turning away out of a sense of discomfort, unwilling to witness Eleanor's humiliation any further. The orchestra, uncertain what to do, had stopped playing entirely, and the resulting silence made every word spoken near the center of the room carry with unbearable clarity. Eleanor looked down at the ring on her finger, the sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, the ring she had worn with such hope and happiness for the past 6 months. She thought, briefly, of the garden party, where Alexander had first placed it there, of the promises they had made to each other beneath the spring sunshine, promises that now felt like nothing more than carefully constructed lies, designed to secure her family's fortune and her father's business connections. She was not yet ready to remove it, not in this exact moment, though she could feel the decision forming somewhere deep within her, quiet and certain, waiting only for the right instant to be spoken aloud. Margaret, sensing the shift in Eleanor's expression, leaned close and whispered, "You do not owe him another word, Eleanor. You have already said everything that needed to be said." But Eleanor was not finished yet. There was still something she needed to do, something that would mark, more clearly than any words could, the end of everything Alexander Ravensworth had promised her, and never intended to deliver. She looked up at him one final time, meeting his eyes across the small distance that separated them, and in that look, Alexander seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time that evening, exactly what he had lost. Eleanor lifted her right hand, and, with steady fingers, began to work the sapphire ring free from her left hand. It resisted for a moment, as rings sometimes do, catching slightly at the knuckle, and in that brief pause the entire room seemed to hold its breath, understanding exactly what was about to happen. The ring came free. She did not throw it. She did not fling it across the room in a dramatic gesture, though a part of her, the part still raw with hurt and humiliation, might have wanted to. Instead, she reached forward and took Alexander's hand, turning it palm upward, with a gentleness that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances, and placed the ring in the center of his open palm. Then she closed his fingers around it, one by one, her touch deliberate and unhurried, as though she were performing a small ceremony of her own design, one that marked an ending rather than a beginning. "You no longer have the right to call me yours," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying just far enough for those nearest to hear, though she was not speaking for the benefit of the crowd anymore. She was speaking directly to Alexander, and to herself, sealing the decision with words that could not be unsaid. Alexander stared down at his closed fist, at the ring now trapped within it, and when he looked up at Eleanor again, his eyes were bright with something that might have been genuine regret, though Eleanor no longer trusted herself to read his expressions accurately. She had believed, for 6 months, that she understood this man completely. She understood now that she had never known him at all. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "please, give me a chance to make this right." "You had 6 months," Eleanor replied. "You had every single day of our engagement to tell me the truth, and instead you chose silence, and then you chose deception, and tonight you chose to let me discover everything in the cruelest possible way, in front of everyone I love. I do not believe there is anything left for you to make right." She turned then, away from Alexander and Isabel and the ring now clutched uselessly in his fist, and looked instead toward the guests who had gathered to celebrate her birthday. Her mother stood near the edge of the crowd, tears streaming silently down her face. Her father's expression had hardened into something cold and furious, directed entirely at the man who had humiliated his daughter in their own family's home. Margaret stood closest of all, her hand extended toward Eleanor, ready to offer whatever support was needed. Eleanor did not reach for Margaret's hand immediately. Instead, she looked once more around the room, at the flowers she had chosen so carefully, at the chandelier beneath which she had imagined dancing with a man who did not deserve her trust, at the cake still waiting untouched on its table near the far wall, its candles unlit, the number 24 written across the top in delicate icing. This had been meant to be a celebration of her life, a marking of another year survived, and, she had hoped, another year of happiness beginning. Instead, it had become the setting for the most painful discovery of her adult life. She would not allow it to become anything more than that. She would not stand in this room a moment longer, allowing Alexander and Isabel to witness whatever grief or anger might still be building within her. "Thank you all for coming," Eleanor said, addressing the room at large, her voice steadier than she felt. "I am sorry that the evening has ended this way. Please, stay and enjoy the celebration if you wish. I find that I no longer have the heart for it." With that, she turned and walked toward the doors at the far end of the reception hall, her steps measured and unhurried, despite the trembling she could feel building beneath her calm exterior. She did not look back at Alexander. She did not look back at Isabel, standing pale and uncertain beside a man who had deceived them both. She walked past her parents, offering her mother a brief, reassuring touch on the arm as she passed, a silent promise that she would explain everything once they were away from this room full of watching eyes. Margaret followed close behind, and together the two women passed through the doors and into the quiet hallway beyond, leaving behind the murmur of 200 stunned guests and the wreckage of a celebration that would be talked about in drawing rooms across the city for months to come. The cool air of the hallway felt like a physical relief after the suffocating heat of the ballroom, and Eleanor allowed herself, finally, to slow her steps, to lean briefly against the wall as the full weight of what had just happened began to settle over her. "You did not have to walk away so quickly," Margaret said softly, standing close beside her. "No one would have blamed you for staying, for saying more, for making him answer for everything he has done." "I said everything I needed to say," Eleanor replied, though her voice had begun to waver now that she was away from the watching crowd. There was nothing more to gain by remaining in that room. He had already shown everyone exactly who he is. I did not need to give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart in front of him as well. Margaret nodded, though her eyes were filled with concern. "Where would you like to go? Your carriage is waiting, if you would like to leave the house entirely." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Part of her wanted nothing more than to return to her own bedroom, to close the door, and allow herself the privacy to finally grieve what she had lost. But another part of her, the part that had carried her steadily through the confrontation in the ballroom, understood that she needed air, needed movement, needed distance from the house, before she could fully process everything that had happened. "The carriage," she said finally. "I would like to go for a drive, if you would come with me." Margaret agreed immediately, and the two women made their way through a side entrance of the house, avoiding the main hall where the remaining guests still lingered in confused, whispering clusters. Eleanor's carriage waited in the courtyard, and as she climbed inside, settling onto the cushioned seat across from Margaret, she finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall. They did not speak for the first several minutes of the drive. Margaret simply reached across the small space between them and took Eleanor's hand, offering silent comfort as the carriage moved slowly through the darkened streets. Eleanor watched the city pass by outside the window, the gas lamps casting soft pools of light across the cobblestones, and tried to make sense of everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. 6 months of what she had believed was genuine love, unraveled in the space of perhaps 20 minutes. A future she had planned in careful detail, gone. A man she had trusted completely, revealed as someone capable of extraordinary deception, someone who had apparently been planning to marry her while maintaining a relationship with another woman throughout the entire engagement. Someone who had lied so casually to both women that neither had suspected the full truth until it was forced into the open in the worst possible way. "I keep thinking about the things he said to me," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence. 3 days ago, he sat in my drawing room and spoke about our wedding as though nothing was wrong. He asked whether I would prefer white roses or lilies for the ceremony. He described, in detail, the nursery he wanted to prepare for our children. How does a person say such things while planning to end the engagement quietly, as he apparently told Isabel he intended to do? Margaret shook her head slowly. "I do not think there is a satisfying answer to that question. Some people are simply capable of holding two entirely different realities in their minds at once, telling each version of the truth to whichever audience is in front of them at the time." "I trusted him completely," Eleanor said, her voice quiet now, exhausted. "I ignored every warning sign because I wanted so badly to believe that what we had was real." "You are not foolish for having trusted him," Margaret said firmly. "He built that trust deliberately, over months, specifically so that you would not question him. The fault here belongs entirely to Alexander, not to you." Eleanor knew, on some level, that Margaret was right, but knowing this intellectually did not erase the sting of humiliation she still felt. The memory of 200 faces watching her discover, in real time, that the life she had believed she was building was nothing more than an elaborate deception. The carriage continued through the quiet streets for nearly an hour, and by the time it finally returned to Eleanor's family home, the birthday celebration had long since ended. The guests dispersed into the night to carry the story of what they had witnessed into every drawing room and dinner party across the city. Eleanor knew that by morning, everyone would know what had happened. She knew that the story would follow her for months, perhaps longer, whispered about at every social gathering she attended. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not care as much as she might have expected. Whatever damage the story did to her reputation, it did far greater damage to Alexander's, and she suspected, as she climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night, exhausted and hollowed out by the events of the evening, that this was a fair trade for the humiliation she had endured. Her mother was waiting in her bedroom when she arrived, having slipped away from the remaining guests to check on her daughter. She rose immediately from the chair by the window and embraced Eleanor tightly, saying nothing for a long moment, simply holding her daughter as the last of Eleanor's composure finally gave way entirely. "I am so sorry," her mother said softly, once Eleanor's tears had begun to slow. "I am so sorry this happened to you, and on your birthday of all nights." "I will be all right," Eleanor said, though her voice still trembled with the effort of believing her own words. "I would rather know the truth now than discover it after we were already married." Her mother pulled back slightly, studying her daughter's face with an expression of fierce, protective love. "You handled yourself with more grace tonight than most people could have managed. I have never been prouder of you." Eleanor allowed herself a small, tired smile at this, grateful for her mother's presence, grateful for Margaret's unwavering support throughout the evening, grateful, even in the midst of her heartbreak, for the family and friends who had rallied around her the moment Alexander's deception became clear. She did not yet know what the coming weeks would hold, did not yet know how the scandal would spread through society, or how Alexander's reputation would crumble in the aftermath of what he had done. She did not yet know that she would find, in the wreckage of her broken engagement, an unexpected strength and independence that would carry her toward a life far richer and more fulfilling than the one she had imagined for herself as Alexander's wife. She knew only, as she finally settled into her bed that night, exhausted beyond measure, that she had survived the worst evening of her life with her dignity intact, and that whatever came next, she would face it as a woman who had already proven, in the most public way imaginable, that she was stronger than anyone had given her credit for being. The sapphire ring remained behind in the ballroom, closed within Alexander's fist, a small, cold reminder of everything he had lost the moment he chose deception over honesty. Eleanor did not think of it again that night. She had already given him everything he deserved from her, and nothing more. By the following morning, the story of Eleanor's birthday had already begun its journey through the city, carried from household to household by servants, who had heard the tale from other servants, by guests who could not resist sharing what they had witnessed, by the simple, unstoppable momentum of scandal once it begins to spread. Eleanor woke to find a stack of letters waiting on her breakfast tray, some offering sympathy, others thinly disguised as sympathy, while actually seeking further details about what had happened. She read only a few of them, before setting the rest aside, unwilling to spend her morning parsing the difference between genuine concern and idle curiosity. Her father joined her at the breakfast table shortly after, his expression grave, and Eleanor understood immediately that he had news to share. "I have already spoken with my solicitor," he said, settling into his chair across from her. "The engagement will be formally and publicly ended. There will be no ambiguity about who ended it, or why." Eleanor appreciated her father's directness, his willingness to handle the practical aftermath of the previous evening, so that she would not need to manage every detail herself. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not think I could face writing those letters myself just yet." "You should not have to," her father replied firmly. "Alexander Ravensworth humiliated you in front of 200 witnesses. The very least I can do is ensure that the world understands exactly what kind of man he proved himself to be." Over the following days, Eleanor learned more about the full scope of Alexander's deception, much of it gathered by Margaret, who seemed determined to uncover every detail her friend deserved to know. Isabelle Fontaine, it turned out, had also ended her relationship with Alexander immediately following the events of the birthday celebration, unwilling to remain connected to a man who had so thoroughly deceived her as well. In a strange twist that Eleanor had not anticipated, she found herself receiving a brief, carefully worded letter from Isabelle a week later, apologizing for the pain she had unknowingly caused, and expressing hope that Eleanor would find happiness after everything that had happened. Eleanor read the letter twice before setting it aside, feeling something she had not expected to feel toward the other woman. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of weary understanding. They had both been deceived by the same man, and there was little use in directing anger toward each other when the true source of the harm lay elsewhere entirely. The weeks that followed the broken engagement were among the most difficult of Eleanor's life. She found herself, for the first time in months, without a clear sense of what her future held. The wedding plans she had been making, the future she had imagined so vividly, had all evaporated in the space of a single evening, leaving her with an unfamiliar emptiness that she did not know how to fill. Margaret visited often during this period, sometimes simply sitting with Eleanor in comfortable silence, other times encouraging her gently to leave the house, to re-engage with the world beyond her own grief. It was Margaret who first suggested that Eleanor might find some purpose in her father's shipping business, an idea that Eleanor initially dismissed as impractical. "Women do not typically involve themselves in matters of trade and commerce," Eleanor said one afternoon, as the two friends sat in the garden where Margaret had first warned her about Alexander's suspicious behavior all those months ago. "Since when have you cared what women typically do?" Margaret replied, raising an eyebrow. "You have always been sharper than most of the men your father does business with. I have heard you discuss his ledgers before, Eleanor. You understand these matters better than you give yourself credit for." Eleanor considered this for several days before finally approaching her father with a tentative request: permission to observe his business dealings more closely, to understand the workings of the shipping company that had built the family's fortune. Her father, surprised but not entirely opposed to the idea, agreed to let her accompany him to his offices, to review correspondence with trading partners, to sit in on meetings where cargo manifests and shipping routes were discussed in careful detail. What began as a distraction from her heartbreak gradually became something more meaningful. Eleanor discovered, over the following months, that she possessed a genuine talent for understanding the complex negotiations that underpinned her father's business, an eye for identifying profitable opportunities that even some of his longtime associates had overlooked. She began attending meetings not merely as an observer but as an active participant, offering opinions that her father, to his credit, took seriously and often acted upon. The work gave her a sense of purpose that had been entirely absent from her life during the months of her engagement, when her primary occupation had been planning a wedding for a man who had never intended to remain faithful to her. She found herself staying late at the offices, poring over shipping manifests and trade agreements with an enthusiasm that surprised even her, discovering in herself a mind for business that she had never before had the opportunity to develop. Society, meanwhile, continued to discuss the scandal of her broken engagement with undiminished interest. Eleanor learned to navigate this attention with a composure that impressed even Margaret, attending social gatherings with her head held high, declining to discuss the details of what had happened while never appearing ashamed of the truth. Where once she might have shrunk from the whispered conversations that followed her through ballrooms and drawing rooms, she now found herself facing them directly, offering brief, dignified acknowledgments before steering conversations toward other subjects entirely. "You have handled this with remarkable grace," her mother observed one evening, as they prepared for a dinner party that Eleanor had initially considered avoiding altogether. "I know it cannot be easy, facing all these questions and whispers." "I would rather face them honestly than hide from them," Eleanor replied, fastening her grandmother's pearl earrings into place, the same earrings she had worn on the night of her birthday, a small act of reclaiming something that had been tainted by Alexander's betrayal. "I did nothing wrong. I see no reason to behave as though I did." Alexander, meanwhile, found his own social standing deteriorating rapidly in the weeks following the scandal. The story of his public humiliation of Eleanor spread quickly among the very circles whose approval he depended upon to maintain his family's remaining influence, and Eleanor heard, through various sources, that invitations to important social events had begun quietly disappearing from his calendar. His financial difficulties, which he had managed to keep largely private during the engagement, became a subject of open speculation once it became clear that Eleanor's substantial dowry would no longer be available to rescue his struggling estate. Eleanor did not seek out this information deliberately, but she found that she could not entirely avoid it either, given how frequently Alexander's misfortunes were discussed in the same social circles she continued to move through. She noticed, with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and something closer to sadness, that the man who had once commanded a room with his effortless charm now found himself increasingly excluded from the gatherings where that charm had once been so effective. She did not wish him active harm, exactly, though she would not have claimed to feel much sympathy for his declining fortunes either. What she felt, more than anything, was a growing sense of distance from the entire situation, as though Alexander Ravensworth and the humiliation he had caused her belonged to a chapter of her life that was gradually closing, replaced by the new and unfamiliar territory of her work at her father's business and the independence she was slowly discovering within herself. 3 months after her broken engagement, Eleanor negotiated her first independent trade agreement, securing favorable terms for a shipment of textiles that her father's longtime associates had considered too risky to pursue. The deal proved enormously profitable, and word of her success spread quickly through the business community, earning her a reputation as a sharp and capable negotiator, someone whose judgment could be trusted even in matters that had traditionally been considered beyond a woman's proper sphere of influence. Her father began introducing her to business partners not simply as his daughter, but as an integral part of the company's future, a shift in status that Eleanor had never anticipated but found deeply satisfying. Where once her identity had been defined primarily by her engagement to a titled man, she now found herself building an identity entirely her own, based on her own abilities and accomplishments, rather than the reflected status of a husband she had never actually married. Margaret, watching this transformation unfold over the following months, often remarked that Eleanor seemed to be blossoming in ways that would never have been possible had she married Alexander as planned. "You would have spent your life managing his estate and smoothing over his mistakes," Margaret observed one afternoon, as the two friends walked together through the same garden where their conversations about Alexander's suspicious behavior had first begun. "Instead, you are building something entirely your own." Eleanor considered this observation carefully, recognizing the truth within it, even as the wound of her broken engagement continued, slowly, to heal. "I would not have chosen this path for myself," she admitted. "But I cannot deny that I am happier now, in this uncertain new life I am building, than I was during those months when I believed I understood exactly what my future would look like." The pain of Alexander's betrayal had not entirely disappeared, and there were still moments, particularly late at night or during quiet hours alone, when Eleanor found herself thinking of the future she had once imagined, the wedding she had planned so carefully, the children she had hoped to raise in a home filled with love rather than deception. But these moments came less frequently as the months passed, gradually replaced by a growing confidence in the life she was building for herself, independent of any man's promises or betrayals. She did not yet know what the coming year would hold, did not yet know that her path would eventually cross with Alexander's again under circumstances neither of them could have anticipated on the night of her 24th birthday. She knew only that she had survived the worst humiliation of her life and emerged from it stronger, more capable, and more fully herself than she had ever been during the months when she had defined her entire future by her engagement to a man who had never deserved her trust. By the time autumn arrived, nearly 6 months after the events of Eleanor's birthday, Alexander's financial situation had become the subject of open discussion throughout the city's business circles. Without the substantial dowry that Eleanor's marriage would have provided, he had been unable to settle the considerable debts he had inherited alongside his title, and his creditors, who had previously shown patience in anticipation of his advantageous marriage, began pressing him for payment with increasing urgency. Eleanor learned of these developments gradually, through conversations overheard at social gatherings, and through her father's own business contacts, many of whom had dealings with the same creditors now circling Alexander's remaining assets. She found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, largely indifferent to the details of his decline. The man who had once occupied the center of her every thought and plan had become, in the months since her birthday, a figure of diminishing relevance to her daily life. Her work at her father's company continued to expand in scope and responsibility. By early winter, she had negotiated 3 additional trade agreements, each more complex and profitable than the last, and her father had begun formally including her name, alongside his own, in the company's official correspondence with major trading partners. The transformation from the heartbroken young woman who had walked out of her own birthday celebration to a respected businesswoman whose judgment carried genuine weight among her father's associates felt, to Eleanor, like a slow but undeniable reclamation of her own life. Margaret, who had remained a constant presence throughout this period, often teased Eleanor about how thoroughly her priorities had shifted. "A year ago, you spoke of nothing but wedding flowers and honeymoon destinations," she observed one evening, as the two friends shared dinner at Eleanor's family home. "Now you speak of shipping manifests and trade tariffs, with the same enthusiasm you once reserved for discussing your future with Alexander." "I suppose I have found something worth being enthusiastic about," Eleanor replied, smiling despite herself. "I did not expect that discovering my own capabilities would prove more satisfying than any wedding could have been, but I find that it has." It was during this period, as Eleanor's professional reputation continued to grow, that she first encountered Henry Callahan, a shipping merchant from a respectable but unremarkable family, who had built his own modest fortune through careful, honest dealings, rather than inherited titles or advantageous marriages. They met at a business gathering hosted by one of her father's longtime associates, where Henry approached her, not with the practiced charm that Alexander had once employed, but with a straightforward curiosity about her recent trade negotiations that Eleanor found immediately refreshing. "I heard about the textile agreement you secured last spring," Henry said, after they had been introduced by a mutual acquaintance. "The terms you negotiated were considerably better than what most of the merchants in this room could have managed. I confess, I am curious how you approached the negotiation." Eleanor found herself explaining the details of the agreement with an enthusiasm she rarely displayed in social settings, and Henry listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak, as so many men in her social circle tended to do. Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, ranging from business matters to broader questions about the shipping industry's future, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since her broken engagement, genuinely enjoying the company of a man who seemed to value her intelligence rather than simply her family connections. She did not allow herself to read too much into this single conversation, mindful of how thoroughly her judgment had failed her with Alexander. But over the following weeks, as Henry began appearing more frequently at the same business gatherings she attended, always engaging her in substantive conversation rather than empty flattery, Eleanor found herself cautiously reconsidering whether trust and affection might still be possible for her, despite everything Alexander had taught her about deception and betrayal. Meanwhile, Alexander's circumstances continued their steady decline. Eleanor learned, through Margaret's careful attention to the city's gossip, that he had been forced to sell several parcels of his estate's land to satisfy his most pressing creditors, and that the grand house he had once described so vividly, the one with gardens he promised to plant for their imagined children, now stood partially closed off, too expensive to maintain in its entirety. Isabel, Eleanor learned, had long since moved on to different circles entirely, apparently unwilling to remain connected to a man whose financial ruin had become as thoroughly public as his earlier deceptions. There was a strange symmetry to this outcome that Eleanor sometimes found herself reflecting upon during quiet moments. Alexander had chosen deception over honesty, had chosen to string along two women simultaneously, rather than face the discomfort of an honest conversation with either of them, and in doing so, had ultimately lost both the marriage that might have secured his financial future and the mistress whose companionship he had valued enough to risk everything else for. Whatever brief satisfaction he had gained from avoiding difficult truths in the months before Eleanor's birthday had cost him, in the end, nearly everything he had hoped to preserve. Eleanor did not spend excessive time dwelling on these developments, though she could not entirely avoid hearing about them given how frequently Alexander's name still surfaced in conversations throughout the business and social circles she moved through. What occupied far more of her attention, as winter deepened into the new year, was the steady growth of her own professional reputation, and the cautious but genuine friendship developing between herself and Henry Callahan. Henry, unlike Alexander, made no grand declarations or sweeping promises about their future together. Instead, he demonstrated his character through consistent, reliable behavior, arriving when he said he would arrive, following through on commitments he made, treating Eleanor's opinions and judgment with genuine respect, rather than performative interest. It was a quieter kind of courtship than what she had experienced with Alexander, but Eleanor found that she valued this steadiness more than she had ever valued Alexander's easy charm. "You seem different when you speak of him," Margaret observed one afternoon, when Eleanor mentioned that Henry had invited her to accompany him on a tour of a new shipping vessel his company had recently acquired. "Not the breathless excitement you felt for Alexander, but something steadier. I think that might be a better foundation, in the end." Eleanor considered this observation carefully. "I think you may be right," she said finally. "With Alexander, I was swept up in the idea of him, the title, the estate, the romance of it all. With Henry, I find myself simply enjoying his company, appreciating his honesty, valuing the way he treats me as an equal rather than simply a prize to be won." This growing friendship with Henry did not develop quickly or dramatically, and Eleanor was careful not to rush toward conclusions that her heart was not yet ready to embrace. The wound left by Alexander's betrayal had not entirely healed, and she remained cautious about placing her trust too readily in another man's promises, however genuine they appeared to be. But the steady, patient nature of Henry's attention gave her room to heal at her own pace, without the pressure of grand romantic gestures or hurried declarations that might have felt, after everything she had experienced, more suspicious than reassuring. As the first anniversary of her broken engagement approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her life had transformed in the 12 months since that devastating birthday celebration. She had built a genuine career for herself, one that commanded respect throughout her father's business circles and beyond. She had discovered a resilience and capability within herself that she had never known existed during the months when her entire identity had been wrapped up in her engagement to Alexander, and she had found, in Henry Callahan's steady, honest companionship, the possibility of a different kind of relationship entirely, one built on mutual respect rather than performance and deception. She did not yet know exactly what the future held, whether her growing friendship with Henry would eventually develop into something more permanent, or whether her career would continue expanding in the directions it had taken over the past year. But she knew, with a certainty that had been entirely absent during the uncertain months following her broken engagement, that whatever came next, she would face it as a woman who had already proven her own strength, a woman who no longer needed a man's title or promises to define her worth. The sapphire ring, last seen closed within Alexander's fist on the night of her birthday, had long since faded from Eleanor's thoughts, replaced by the steady, unglamorous satisfaction of a life built through her own effort and determination. Whatever Alexander had once represented to her, whatever future she had once imagined sharing with him, belonged now to a chapter of her life that had closed completely, making room for the new and far more promising chapter that had begun to unfold in its place. Spring returned to the city, and with it came the one-year anniversary of the celebration that had changed the course of Eleanor's life so completely. She marked the occasion quietly this time, choosing a small gathering with her closest family and friends, rather than the grand ballroom event she had planned the previous year. Margaret was there, of course, along with her parents and a handful of trusted friends, who had stood beside her through the difficult months following her broken engagement. Henry attended as well, having become, over the preceding months, a regular presence in Eleanor's life. Their relationship had developed slowly and deliberately, built on the foundation of shared professional respect that had first drawn them together, gradually deepening into something warmer and more personal as the months passed. He had never pressed her to move faster than she felt ready for, understanding instinctively that the wounds left by Alexander's betrayal required patience rather than urgency to heal. As the small gathering settled into comfortable conversation over dinner, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how different this celebration felt from the one that had preceded it, exactly a year earlier. There was no grand ballroom, no elaborate flower arrangements, no anxious anticipation about a fiancé's arrival. Instead, there was simply the quiet contentment of being surrounded by people who genuinely cared for her, in a life she had built through her own determination, rather than through any man's promises. "You look happy," her mother observed, as the two of them stepped out onto the terrace for a moment of quiet air, away from the gathering inside. "Truly happy, in a way I have not seen since before everything happened with Alexander." Eleanor considered this observation, turning it over in her mind before responding. "I think I am happy," she said finally. "Not in the way I expected to be happy a year ago, when I imagined my future as Alexander's wife, but happy in a way that feels more solid, more entirely my own." Her mother smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "That is, I think, a far better kind of happiness, to build a life around." Inside, the conversation had turned to business matters, with Henry and Eleanor's father discussing a potential joint venture between their respective companies, a partnership that had been developing gradually over the preceding months as their families' business interests increasingly overlapped. Eleanor listened with interest, occasionally offering her own perspective on the negotiations, and she noticed, not for the first time, how naturally Henry deferred to her judgment on matters where her expertise exceeded his own, a stark contrast to the way Alexander had always spoken over her opinions, or dismissed them entirely in favor of his own assumptions. It was later that evening, after most of the guests had departed and only Margaret and Henry remained, that Eleanor received an unexpected piece of news that would set in motion the final chapter of her long journey away from the humiliation of her broken engagement. A letter arrived, delivered by a messenger who had clearly been instructed to wait for a response, and Eleanor recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, despite not having seen it in nearly a year. Alexander. She held the envelope for a long moment before opening it. aware of Margaret's watchful concern and Henry's carefully neutral expression, as both of her closest companions waited to see how she would respond to this unexpected contact from her past. The letter, when she finally opened and read it, was brief and carefully worded. Alexander wrote that he had heard of her professional success and wished to congratulate her on the life she had built for herself. He wrote that he had thought often, over the past year, about the pain he had caused her, and that he hoped, if she were willing, they might meet briefly so that he could offer the apology he had never properly given on the night of her birthday. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that his circumstances had changed considerably since that evening, though he did not elaborate on the details. Eleanor read the letter twice before setting it down on the table beside her, aware that both Margaret and Henry were watching her carefully, waiting to understand what she intended to do. "You do not have to respond to him at all," Margaret said quietly. "You owe him nothing, Eleanor. Not your time, not your forgiveness, not even the courtesy of a reply." Eleanor nodded slowly, appreciating her friend's protective instinct even as she considered her own feelings on the matter. She looked toward Henry, curious about his reaction, and found his expression carefully composed, offering no pressure in either direction. "What do you think I should do?" she asked him directly. Henry considered the question seriously before answering. "I think that decision belongs entirely to you," he said. "Whatever you decide, whether you choose to meet with him or to ignore his letter entirely, I will support your choice. I only hope that whatever you decide, you make the choice that brings you the most peace, rather than the choice you feel obligated to make." Eleanor appreciated the honesty of this response, the absence of any attempt to influence her decision toward an outcome that might have benefited Henry's own interests. She sat with the question for several days, weighing her own feelings carefully, before finally deciding that she would agree to a brief meeting with Alexander, not out of any lingering affection for him, but out of a desire to close this chapter of her life completely, on her own terms, rather than leaving it as an open wound that might continue to affect her in ways she could not fully control. She arranged the meeting for a quiet afternoon at a public tea house, choosing a neutral location where she would feel entirely in control of the circumstances, and she asked Margaret to accompany her, waiting nearby in case her support was needed. When the appointed day arrived, Eleanor dressed carefully, not for Alexander's benefit, but for her own sense of composure, choosing a simple but elegant gown that reflected the confidence she had built over the preceding year. Alexander was already waiting when she arrived, and Eleanor noticed immediately how much he had changed since she had last seen him. The confident, effortless charm that had once defined his presence had been replaced by something more subdued, almost humbled. His clothing, while still respectable, no longer carried the same expensive polish she remembered from their engagement, a visible sign of the financial difficulties that had befallen him over the preceding year. He rose as she approached the table, his expression carrying a mixture of nervousness and genuine remorse that Eleanor had not expected to see. "Eleanor," he said, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Eleanor took her seat across from him, maintaining a composed, neutral expression as she settled into the chair. "I agreed to hear whatever you wished to say," she replied. "I did not agree to anything beyond that." Alexander nodded, accepting this boundary without protest. "I understand. I only wanted the opportunity to properly apologize, something I never managed to do that night, or in any of the months since." He spoke for several minutes, offering an apology that seemed, to Eleanor's careful assessment, genuinely felt rather than merely performed for her benefit. He acknowledged the cruelty of bringing Isabel to her birthday celebration, acknowledged the months of deception that had preceded that evening, and acknowledged, with what appeared to be real remorse, the pain he had caused not only to Eleanor but to Isabel as well. Both women deceived simultaneously by his inability to face difficult truths honestly. Eleanor listened without interrupting, allowing him to speak fully before offering her own response. "I appreciate the apology," she said finally, once he had finished. "I believe you mean it, or at least I believe you have had a year to reflect on the consequences of your choices and have arrived at some genuine understanding of the harm you caused." "I have lost a great deal this past year," Alexander said quietly. "The estate, much of my remaining fortune, most of the social connections I once relied upon. I do not say this seeking your sympathy, only to explain that I have had ample time to understand exactly what I threw away when I chose deception over honesty with you." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, searching within herself for whatever remnant of her old feelings toward him might still remain. She found, to her own quiet satisfaction, that whatever affection she had once felt for Alexander Ravensworth had entirely faded, replaced by a calm, distant sort of pity that carried none of the pain or anger that had once accompanied any thought of him. "I do not feel anger toward you any longer," she said finally. "I do not feel much of anything, if I am honest. You made choices that hurt me deeply, and those choices had consequences, for both of us. I have moved forward from that pain, built a life I am genuinely proud of, and I find that I have very little interest in revisiting what happened between us, beyond this single conversation." Alexander's expression shifted slightly at this response, something like disappointment crossing his features, though he did not protest. "I had hoped, perhaps, that we might find some way to reconnect," he admitted. "I understand now that this hope was unrealistic." "It was," Eleanor confirmed, without unkindness, but also without any softening of her position. "I wish you well, Alexander, in whatever comes next for you, but I have built a life that no longer has room for you in it, and I do not intend to make space for you again." She rose from the table then, gathering her gloves and offering a final, polite nod before turning to leave. Margaret, who had been waiting nearby throughout the conversation, joined her as she stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, and Eleanor felt, walking away from that meeting, a sense of closure she had not fully realized she still needed. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, as they began walking together toward Eleanor's waiting carriage. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "Free," she said finally. "I feel entirely free of him, in a way I did not realize I had not yet achieved until just now." In the months that followed her final conversation with Alexander, Eleanor found herself moving through life with a lightness she had not experienced since before her engagement had ever begun. The meeting had closed a door she had not fully realized remained open, and with that closure came a renewed sense of possibility about the future she was building for herself. Her relationship with Henry continued to deepen throughout the summer months, though neither of them rushed toward any grand declarations or formal arrangements. Instead, their bond grew through the accumulation of small, meaningful moments. Long conversations about business strategy that somehow always drifted into more personal territory. Quiet dinners, where Henry listened attentively to Eleanor's account of her day. Shared laughter over minor mishaps that occurred during their occasional joint ventures into new trade negotiations. Eleanor's professional reputation, meanwhile, had grown to the point where she was regularly consulted by other merchants and business owners throughout the city, her opinion sought on matters ranging from shipping routes to contract negotiations. Her father, watching his daughter's transformation with evident pride, had begun formally preparing to transition greater responsibility for the company's daily operations into her hands, recognizing that her judgment and capability had long since exceeded what he had originally imagined possible when she first asked to observe his business dealings more closely. "I never expected this to be where your path led," her father admitted one evening, as they reviewed a complex trade agreement together in his study. "When you first asked to learn about the business, I thought perhaps it would occupy you for a few months, while you recovered from the disappointment of your broken engagement. I did not imagine you would become genuinely essential to the company's future." Eleanor smiled at this observation, recognizing the truth within it, even as she reflected on how far she had traveled from the heartbroken young woman who had first approached her father with a tentative request to learn about his business. "Neither did I," she admitted. "I think Alexander's betrayal, painful as it was, forced me to discover capabilities within myself that I might never have explored otherwise. I am not grateful for what he did, but I have come to appreciate the person I became because of how I chose to respond to it." This sentiment, that her strength had emerged not despite her heartbreak but through her deliberate response to it, became something of a guiding philosophy for Eleanor as she continued building her life throughout the following months. She began mentoring other young women who expressed interest in business matters, recognizing that her own unconventional path might serve as an example for others who found themselves, whether through circumstance or choice, seeking a different kind of future than the one traditionally expected of women in her social position. Margaret, watching her closest friends' continued transformation with evident satisfaction, often remarked that Eleanor had become almost unrecognizable from the anxious young woman who had once measured her own worth primarily by Alexander's attention and approval. "You used to ask my opinion about everything," Margaret observed one afternoon, as they walked together through the same garden where their friendship had weathered so many important conversations over the years. Now you simply tell me what you have already decided, and I find myself agreeing with your reasoning nearly every time. I suppose I finally learned to trust my own judgment, Eleanor replied, rather than constantly seeking validation from others before I could feel confident in my own decisions. As autumn approached once more, nearly 18 months after the birthday celebration that had upended her life so completely, Eleanor found herself facing a new and welcome kind of decision. Henry, during a quiet dinner at his family's modest but comfortable home, finally spoke openly about his feelings for her, expressing a hope that their relationship might deepen into something more permanent, while carefully emphasizing that he understood if she needed more time before considering such a step. Eleanor listened to his careful, honest words with none of the breathless excitement she had once felt during Alexander's whirlwind courtship, but with something she had come to value far more, a calm, steady certainty that this man's character had been proven through consistent, honest behavior over many months, rather than through empty promises and grand romantic gestures that ultimately concealed a fundamental dishonesty. I am not seeking a dramatic proposal or an elaborate courtship, she told him, taking his hand across the small table between them. I have already experienced that, and I learned, in the most painful way possible, how little such things actually mean if they are not built on genuine honesty. What I want, if I am to consider a future with anyone, is exactly what you have already shown me: consistency, respect, and honesty, even when honesty is difficult. That is what I hope to offer you, Henry replied, for as long as you will allow me the privilege of trying. They did not rush toward a formal engagement in the weeks that followed this conversation, both of them mindful of Eleanor's earlier experience and unwilling to repeat the hurried pace that had characterized her relationship with Alexander. Instead, they continued building their bond slowly and deliberately, allowing trust to develop naturally, rather than forcing it through grand declarations. And Eleanor found that this patient, unhurried approach brought her a sense of security she had never experienced during her whirlwind courtship with Alexander. Her father, observing the steady development of Eleanor's relationship with Henry, expressed his approval not through the eager enthusiasm he had once shown for her match with a titled duke, but through a quieter, more meaningful satisfaction. "He treats you as an equal," her father observed one evening, watching Henry and Eleanor discuss a business matter together, with evident mutual respect. "That matters far more, I have come to understand, than any title or inherited estate ever could." Eleanor agreed wholeheartedly with this assessment, recognizing how thoroughly her priorities had shifted since the painful night of her birthday celebration. Where once she had valued Alexander's title and the social advantages it represented, she now understood that genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and honest communication, offered a far more solid foundation for lasting happiness than any inherited status ever could. As winter approached once more, Eleanor's professional and personal life had settled into a rhythm that brought her genuine contentment, a state of being she had not experienced during the anxious, uncertain months of her engagement to Alexander. She had built a career that commanded respect throughout the city's business circles, had cultivated a relationship with Henry built on honesty and mutual admiration rather than deception and performance, and had discovered within herself a resilience and independence that no man's approval or betrayal could ever again fully undermine. She thought occasionally of the woman she had been on the night of her 24th birthday, standing frozen in shock as Alexander walked through the ballroom doors with Isabel on his arm, and she found that she felt a kind of tender compassion toward that younger version of herself, someone who had trusted so completely and been so thoroughly betrayed. That woman could not have imagined, in the depths of her humiliation and heartbreak, the life that would eventually unfold from the wreckage of that terrible evening. Eleanor was grateful, in a way she could not have anticipated at the time, that her younger self had found the strength to remove that ring, to walk out of the ballroom with her dignity intact, and to build, from that painful beginning, a life entirely her own. 2 years after the night that had changed the course of her life so completely, Eleanor stood once again in her family's largest reception hall, surrounded by flowers she had chosen, with the same careful attention she had once devoted to a celebration that ended in heartbreak. This time, however, the occasion was entirely different, and the anxious uncertainty that had colored her preparations 2 years earlier had been replaced by a settled, joyful confidence that came from knowing exactly what she wanted and having built the life to achieve it on her own terms. Henry had proposed during a quiet evening at her family's garden, choosing no elaborate public spectacle but instead a simple, heartfelt conversation that reflected everything Eleanor had come to value about their relationship. He had spoken plainly about his admiration for her intelligence, her resilience, and her unwavering honesty, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the empty charm that had once deceived her so completely. When he asked whether she would consider building a future together, Eleanor had answered without hesitation, certain in a way she had never quite managed to feel during her engagement to Alexander, despite all his grand declarations and romantic gestures. The wedding preparations that followed felt entirely different from the plans she had once made for a life with Alexander. Where her previous engagement had been characterized by an underlying anxiety she had refused to fully acknowledge, her preparations for marrying Henry proceeded with a calm certainty that reflected the honest foundation upon which their relationship had been built. She found herself genuinely excited rather than anxiously hopeful, secure in her understanding of the man she was about to marry, rather than desperately trying to convince herself that her doubts were unfounded. Margaret, serving once again as her closest confidant throughout the preparations, remarked frequently on how different Eleanor seemed during this second engagement. "You are not performing happiness this time," Margaret observed one afternoon, as the two friends reviewed final details for the upcoming ceremony. "You are simply happy, without any need to convince yourself or anyone else of it." Eleanor smiled at this observation, recognizing its truth. "I spent so much of my engagement to Alexander trying to ignore the doubts I felt, trying to convince myself that everything was exactly as wonderful as it appeared on the surface. With Henry, I have never once needed to talk myself into believing something that was not already true." Her father, who had watched with quiet pride as his daughter transformed from a heartbroken young woman into a respected businesswoman and now into a bride, who approached her marriage with clear-eyed confidence, spoke to her privately on the morning of her wedding, offering words that Eleanor would carry with her for the rest of her life. "I was so eager, 2 years ago, to see you married to a titled man," he admitted, sitting beside her as she prepared for the ceremony. "I believed that connection would secure advantages for our family that I could not provide through business alone. I did not consider carefully enough whether that man deserved you, whether his character matched the status he carried. I have learned, watching you build this life for yourself, that character matters far more than title, and that a woman's own capabilities matter more than any advantageous marriage could ever provide." Eleanor embraced her father warmly, grateful for this acknowledgement, grateful too for the journey that had led her to this moment, one that she would never have chosen deliberately, but that had ultimately delivered her to a life far richer and more genuinely fulfilling than the one she had once imagined for herself as Alexander's wife. The ceremony itself proceeded with a warmth and joy that Eleanor had never quite dared to imagine possible during the difficult months following her broken engagement. Henry stood waiting for her at the altar, with an expression of such genuine, uncomplicated happiness that Eleanor felt any lingering doubt about the wisdom of trusting again dissolve entirely. This was not the performance of love that Alexander had so skillfully constructed. This was the simple, honest reality of a man who valued her exactly as she was, without pretense or hidden agenda. Among the guests gathered to witness the ceremony, Eleanor noticed several familiar faces from the business circles she had come to know so well over the preceding 2 years, merchants and traders, who had come to respect her not merely as her father's daughter, but as a formidable businesswoman in her own right. She noticed too the absence of many faces that had once populated her social circle during her engagement to Alexander, connections that had proven, in retrospect, to be built more on his title than on any genuine regard for her, connections that had quietly faded once the scandal of her broken engagement made association with her socially inconvenient. She did not mourn the loss of these superficial relationships. If anything, their absence from her wedding day only reinforced how much more meaningful the people who remained in her life had proven to be. Friends and family members who had stood beside her through her most difficult moments, and who now celebrated with genuine joy as she began this new and more authentic chapter of her life. As the ceremony concluded and Eleanor exchanged her final vows with Henry, she found her thoughts drifting briefly to the night of her 24th birthday, to the moment when she had placed her sapphire ring into Alexander's closed fist and walked away from the celebration that had been meant to mark a beginning, but had instead marked an ending. That painful moment, she understood now, had been the true beginning of everything that followed: her career, her independence, her deeper understanding of her own strength and worth, and ultimately, her genuine and honest love for the man now standing beside her as her husband. She did not know, as she celebrated her wedding day surrounded by family and friends who had witnessed her entire journey from heartbreak to genuine happiness, what had become of Alexander Ravensworth in the months since their brief, final conversation at the tea house. She had heard occasional fragments of information through mutual acquaintances, suggestions that his financial circumstances had continued to decline, that he had eventually been forced to sell the remaining portions of his estate to satisfy his creditors entirely. But these details reached her only distantly now, as though describing a stranger's life, rather than a man who had once occupied the center of her every hope and plan. What mattered to Eleanor, on this day of genuine celebration, was not the fate of the man who had once betrayed her so publicly, but the life she had built in the aftermath of that betrayal, a life defined by her own accomplishments, her own resilience, and now, her own honest and equal partnership with a man who had never once given her reason to doubt his character. As the wedding celebration continued into the evening, Eleanor found herself dancing with Henry beneath the same chandelier where, 2 years earlier, she had imagined dancing with Alexander on the night of her broken birthday celebration. The symmetry did not escape her notice, and she found herself smiling as she considered how completely different this moment felt from the anxious hope she had once carried for a very different future. "What are you thinking about?" Henry asked, noticing her thoughtful expression as they moved together to the music. "I am thinking," Eleanor replied, "about how grateful I am, in the end, for everything that happened 2 years ago. I would never have chosen that pain deliberately, but I would not trade the life it led me to for anything." Henry pulled her slightly closer, his expression warm with understanding. "I am grateful for it too," he said, selfishly, "because it eventually led you to me." Eleanor laughed softly at this, resting her head briefly against his shoulder as they continued dancing, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the genuine happiness of family and friends who had supported her through every difficult step of the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years after her wedding to Henry, Eleanor stood at the helm of what had become one of the most respected trading companies in the city, having formally merged her father's original shipping business with Henry's own modest but steadily growing enterprise into a single, thriving operation that bore both of their family names. Her reputation as a shrewd and honest negotiator had spread well beyond the boundaries of the city itself, and merchants from distant ports had begun specifically requesting to conduct their business through her personal oversight, trusting her judgment above that of many of her male counterparts who had once dismissed her involvement in trade as an unusual novelty rather than a genuine asset. Her marriage to Henry had grown steadily richer with each passing year, built on the same foundation of honesty and mutual respect that had characterized their relationship from its earliest beginnings. They had welcomed a daughter into their family the previous spring, a bright-eyed child whom they named Charlotte, and Eleanor found herself experiencing a depth of contentment in her daily life that the anxious young woman planning her wedding to Alexander could never have imagined possible. It was during this period of settled happiness and professional success that Eleanor received word, through a mutual business acquaintance, of Alexander's final and complete financial collapse. The remaining portions of his estate had been sold to satisfy his creditors entirely, and he had reportedly left the city altogether, seeking whatever modest opportunities might remain available to him in a smaller town, where his name and reputation carried less immediate recognition. Eleanor received this news with a calm, distant sort of acknowledgement, feeling neither satisfaction at his downfall nor any lingering sympathy for his circumstances. Alexander Ravensworth had become, in the years since her broken engagement, a figure so entirely separate from her current life that news of his fate registered as little more than a passing observation, quickly set aside in favor of the more immediate concerns of her own thriving business and growing family. "Does it trouble you at all?" Margaret asked one afternoon, as the two friends sat together in Eleanor's garden, watching young Charlotte play among the flower beds, to hear how completely his life has unraveled. Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I do not think it troubles me," she said finally. "I do not wish him active harm, and I recognize that his downfall stemmed entirely from choices he made himself, choices I had no part in, beyond refusing to allow his deception to define the remainder of my own life. But I find that I feel very little about him at all these days, whether positive or negative. He simply belongs to a chapter of my life that closed a long time ago, Margaret nodded, understanding this sentiment completely, having witnessed firsthand Eleanor's remarkable transformation from the devastated young woman who had walked out of her own birthday celebration into the confident, accomplished woman she had become. "I think that is perhaps the healthiest response you could have," Margaret observed, not consumed by anger or bitterness, but simply free of him entirely. This freedom, Eleanor reflected often during this period of her life, had not come easily or automatically in the aftermath of Alexander's betrayal. It had required deliberate effort, the decision to pursue purpose through her father's business rather than retreating into grief, the patience to allow trust with Henry to develop slowly and honestly, rather than rushing toward another potentially hollow romance, and the willingness to finally confront Alexander directly, closing that chapter of her life on her own terms, rather than allowing it to remain an unresolved wound that might have continued affecting her in ways she could not fully control. She thought sometimes about the advice she might offer to other young women who found themselves facing similar betrayals, and she began, gradually, to share her own story more openly with the young women she mentored through her business connections, hoping that her experience might offer some measure of guidance or comfort to others navigating their own difficult journeys through heartbreak and betrayal. "The pain does not disappear immediately," she told one young woman who had recently discovered her own fiancé's infidelity. A conversation that took place in Eleanor's office, overlooking the busy harbor, where her company's ships regularly departed for distant ports. "But I promise you that it does eventually become something you can carry, without it defining every aspect of your life. The most important thing I learned from my own experience was that my worth was never actually dependent on that man's honesty or dishonesty. It took me time to understand that fully, but once I did, I found a strength within myself that I never could have discovered had I simply married him and spent my life ignoring the doubts I should have trusted from the beginning." This advice, offered with the hard-won wisdom of her own painful experience, resonated deeply with the young women who sought her counsel over the following years, and Eleanor found unexpected satisfaction in helping others navigate their own versions of the betrayal she had once endured, offering them the perspective and support that Margaret had so generously provided her during her own darkest months. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor's family grew alongside her business, with a second child, a son they named William, joining Charlotte in their happy household. Henry remained, throughout all these years, exactly the steady, honest partner he had proven himself to be from their earliest acquaintance, never once giving Eleanor reason to doubt the trust she had so carefully and deliberately extended to him after the devastation of her broken engagement to Alexander. She often reflected, during quiet evening moments spent with her family, on how completely different her life had become from the one she had once imagined for herself as Alexander's wife. Where that imagined life had been built on borrowed status and hidden deception, the life she had actually built for herself rested on genuine achievement and honest partnership, a foundation far more solid and satisfying than any title or inherited estate could ever have provided. The sapphire ring, that small symbol of a promise Alexander had never truly intended to keep, had long since faded from Eleanor's memory as anything more than a distant footnote in the story of her life, a small object that had once represented everything she believed she wanted, before she discovered, through painful experience, what she actually needed to build genuine and lasting happiness. 10 years after the night that had once threatened to define the entirety of her future, Eleanor Whitmore Callahan stood in the same reception hall where her 24th birthday celebration had ended, in such devastating humiliation, now hosting a very different kind of gathering entirely. A celebration marking the 10th anniversary of the trading company she had built alongside her husband, an enterprise that had grown to become one of the most respected and prosperous businesses in the entire region. The room, filled once again with flowers she had chosen with careful attention, bore little resemblance in feeling to the anxious, hopeful celebration of a decade earlier, where that younger version of herself had waited nervously for a man whose loyalty she should never have trusted. The Eleanor who stood in this room now moved with the settled confidence of a woman who had built every aspect of her success through her own determination and integrity, alongside a husband who had matched that integrity every single day of their marriage. Charlotte, now 9 years old, moved through the gathering with the easy confidence of a child raised in a household defined by honesty and mutual respect, while young William, 6 years old, remained close to his father's side, watching the business gathering with the same curious attention that had once drawn Eleanor toward the world of trade and negotiation herself. Eleanor watched her children with quiet pride, grateful that they would grow up understanding, through her own example, that genuine strength came not from titles or borrowed status, but from honest effort and unwavering integrity. Margaret, still her closest confidant after all these years, found her way to Eleanor's side as the celebration reached its peak, offering the same steady friendship that had carried Eleanor through the darkest night of her young adulthood and every difficult moment that had followed. "Do you ever think about that night anymore?" Margaret asked quietly, watching the joyful gathering around them. Eleanor considered the question carefully, genuinely searching her own feelings before answering. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted, though not with the pain it once carried. "I think about it now more as the beginning of everything that actually mattered, rather than as an ending I once feared it might become." It was later that same evening, as the celebration began winding toward its natural conclusion, that Eleanor received word from one of her household staff that a man had arrived at the entrance, requesting a brief audience with her. The staff member's hesitant expression suggested some discomfort with the request, and when Eleanor asked for the visitor's name, she felt a small, distant flicker of recognition upon hearing it spoken aloud after so many years of silence. Alexander Ravensworth had come to see her. Eleanor considered, for a brief moment, simply declining the request entirely, unwilling to allow any shadow from her past to interrupt the genuine celebration of everything she had built in the years since their painful final conversation. But curiosity, along with a settled confidence that nothing this man could say or do would meaningfully affect the security of her current happiness, led her instead to agree to a brief meeting, choosing to receive him privately in a small study away from the main celebration. The man who entered the study bore little resemblance to the confident, charming Duke who had once swept Eleanor off her feet with easy promises and effortless charm. Alexander appeared considerably older than his actual years, his clothing modest and worn in a way that reflected the financial ruin she had heard about from occasional distant reports over the preceding decade. His posture, once carried with the easy assurance of inherited privilege, now suggested something closer to weary resignation. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying none of its former confidence, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I understand I have no right to interrupt your celebration." "You do not," Eleanor confirmed, though not unkindly. "But I am curious, what brings you here after so many years of silence?" Alexander seemed to gather himself before continuing, his expression carrying a genuine humility that Eleanor had never witnessed from him during the months of their engagement, when his charm had always seemed to carry an underlying current of careless self-assurance. "I have spent the past decade reflecting on the choices that led to my current circumstances," he said. "I have lost nearly everything I once possessed, and in losing it, I have finally come to understand exactly what I threw away when I chose deception over honesty with you, all those years ago." Eleanor listened to this admission with a calm, measured attention, feeling neither satisfaction at his obvious struggles nor any renewed anger at the memory of what he had once done to her. "I appreciate you telling me this," she said, "but I confess I am uncertain what you hope to gain by sharing it with me now, after so many years." "Nothing," Alexander said quickly. "I do not seek anything from you, Eleanor. I only wanted the opportunity to tell you that I have watched, from a distance, everything you have built for yourself over these past years, and that I am genuinely glad your life turned out so much better than anything I could ever have offered you. I wanted you to know that I understand now, fully and completely, that walking away from me that night was the wisest decision you ever made." Eleanor studied his weathered, humbled face for a long moment, searching within herself for whatever remnant of her old feelings toward this man might still remain. She found, as she had found during their final conversation a decade earlier, that whatever pain or anger she had once carried had long since faded entirely, replaced now by a distant, almost impersonal sort of understanding. "I do not feel anger toward you any longer, Alexander," she said finally. "I have not felt it in a very long time, if I am honest. What happened between us caused me tremendous pain, but it also led me toward a life I would never trade for anything, a life built on my own strength and on genuine partnership with a man who has never once given me reason to doubt him. I find that I am grateful, in a strange way, for the painful lesson you taught me, even though I would never wish to relive the experience itself." Alexander nodded slowly, accepting this response with evident acceptance rather than any lingering hope for reconciliation. I am glad, he said simply. That is all I hope to hear. He rose to leave shortly after, offering a final, respectful nod before departing the study, and Eleanor watched him go with a sense of complete and final closure, understanding that this brief conversation had marked the true and permanent end of whatever connection had once existed between them, a connection that had caused her tremendous pain but had also, ultimately, set her on the path toward everything genuinely meaningful in her life. She returned to the celebration shortly after, finding Henry waiting for her with a quiet, understanding expression, having apparently been informed of their unexpected visitor by the household staff. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking her hand gently as she rejoined him among the gathered guests. "I am," Eleanor replied, and found, as she spoke the words, that she meant them completely. "I think I finally understand that the night of my 24th birthday, painful as it was, gave me everything I actually needed, even though it took away everything I thought I wanted at the time." Henry smiled warmly at this, pulling her close as the orchestra began playing once more, the same beautiful music that had once accompanied the collapse of her first engagement, now providing the soundtrack for a celebration built on genuine achievement and honest love. Eleanor rested her head against her husband's shoulder as they moved together to the music, surrounded by her children, her closest friends, and the thriving business she had built through her own determination and integrity. She thought, one final time, of the young woman who had stood frozen in shock on that terrible night a decade earlier, watching Alexander walk through the ballroom doors with another woman on his arm, and she felt, more than anything else, a deep and abiding gratitude toward that younger self, the woman who had found the strength to remove her ring, to place it firmly into his closed fist, and to walk away from a life built on deception in favor of building something entirely her own. That single act of quiet, dignified courage, performed in front of 200 witnesses on the worst night of her young life, had ultimately given her everything that truly mattered: a career built on her own genuine ability, a marriage built on honest partnership, children raised in a household defined by integrity rather than pretense, and a deep, settled understanding of her own worth that no man's betrayal could ever again threaten to undermine. The Duke had brought his lover to her birthday, believing perhaps that Eleanor would simply endure the humiliation quietly, as so many women of her era might have been expected to do. Instead, she had given him back his ring and walked away, choosing her own dignity over his broken promises, and in doing so, had built for herself a life far richer and more genuinely fulfilling than anything he could ever have offered her. It was, she reflected, watching her family and friends celebrate around her in the warm glow of candlelight, the finest decision she had ever made.